The signal came in fragments. That was the first sign something was wrong. Velthari transmissions were always crisp, always precise. Their communication arrays were the finest in the Concord, engineered over 4 centuries of careful scientific refinement. But this signal arrived broken, stuttering, wrapped in static so thick it sounded like the universe itself was trying to swallow the words before anyone could hear them. Commander Thessaly of the Yokai monitoring station pressed her 4-fingered hands flat against her console and leaned in. Around her, 12 technicians had gone completely silent. Under attack, formation collapsed. We cannot, the Drevak, they are not stopping. They are not accepting surrender, they are just. A sound, not an explosion. Something worse. The wet, tearing frequency of a ship being split open in vacuum. 400,000 civilians still on the surface. We are requesting immediate. Static. Then nothing. Thessaly stared at the dead channel for 6 full seconds. Then she turned to her second officer and said, very quietly, "Get the council on the line, all of them, now." What followed in the next 3 hours would later be described by historians as the most catastrophic diplomatic failure in Concord history. Not because the council acted wrongly, but because they barely acted at all. The assembled representatives of 19 spacefaring civilizations sat inside the great amber dome chamber of Concord Station Muravel and watched the Velthari Confederation die in real time. Sensor drones, positioned at the edge of the system, fed back imagery that no one in that chamber would ever fully forget. The Drevak Supremacy's warships moved in perfect geometric formation, dark, angular vessels that looked less like ships and more like wounds cut into the fabric of space. They did not negotiate. They did not broadcast demands. They simply fired and fired and fired. The Velthari Defense Fleet, 48 ships, seasoned crews, decorated veterans of 3 previous border conflicts, lasted 6 hours and 11 minutes. Then they were gone. Then the Drevak turned toward the planet. Delegate Orvan of the Pelithari species moved to submit a formal military response. He needed 8 votes. He received 3. The other delegates cited proximity to Drevak territory, logistical constraints, the need for further intelligence, the importance of measured response. Keel Ambassador Foss of the Emrithian sovereignty used a phrase that would haunt him for the rest of his life. We must not be hasty. The planet's northern continent went dark on the sensors 40 minutes later. It was Ambassador Saren of the Yokai who stood up and left the chamber. Not dramatically, not with a speech. She simply stood, adjusted her ceremonial collar, and walked out through the side corridor to her private communications office. She sat down at her desk. She pulled up a channel that had been registered in Concord databases for 31 years, but had never once been used in a formal diplomatic emergency. The classification attached to it was almost insulting in its dismissiveness. Species human Terran, developmental status emerging, military capacity limited, Concord threat assessment negligible. Saren looked at that last word for a long moment. Then she opened the channel anyway. She did not transmit a formal request. She did not use diplomatic language or Concord protocol. She had watched 400,000 civilians vanish from a sensor screen 40 minutes ago. She was done with protocol. She simply said, "Earth, the Velthari are gone. The Drevak did it in one night. The Council is doing nothing. I don't know if you can help. I don't know what you have, but I'm asking." She closed the channel and sat in the dark. The reply came in 11 minutes. It was not a message. It was a data packet, a single file containing a vector projection. 47 ship signatures, already moving, already beyond Mars orbit, already accelerating at a rate that made Saren's atmospheric processor stutter. Below the projection, one line of text in standard Concord script. "We've been watching the Drevak for 11 years. We're already on our way. Keep the channel open." Saren stared at that message for a very long time. Then she did something she had not done since she was a child. She felt, without any logical justification whatsoever, that things might somehow be all right. She didn't know why. She would understand why later. On the other side of the conquered chamber, Delegate Foss was still talking about the importance of measured response. His speech was very thorough. He had prepared it well. Nobody in the corridor outside was listening anymore. Word travels fast, even in space, especially when the word is this: the humans are coming. The UEAS Thermopylae was not a beautiful ship. The yokai built their vessels in flowing curves, silver white and elegant, designed to look as graceful cutting through a nebula as they did sitting in dock. The Pelithari preferred deep violet hulls with sweeping fins, a cultural aesthetic carried over from their ocean-dwelling ancestors. Even the Emerithian warships had a certain brutal grandeur to them, massive, yes, but symmetrical in a way that satisfied the eye. The Thermopylae looked like someone had built a fist out of dark steel and pointed it at the stars. She was 4 kilometers long and almost half that wide at her broadest point. Her hull was the color of old iron, interrupted by the muted glow of weapons emplacements so numerous that a Velthari naval engineer, had any survived, would have looked at the schematics and assumed it was an error. The bridge was buried 300 meters inside the ship, behind layers of reinforced alloy and shock-dampening architecture, because Admiral Yara Osai had designed her flagship with one foundational principle in mind. She would keep fighting long after any other ship would have stopped. Osai stood at the primary tactical display and watched her fleet accelerate out of the solar system. Behind the Thermopylae came 46 others, arranged in a formation that no conquered tactician would have recognized, because it hadn't been pulled from any conquered tactical manual. It had been developed in classified wargame simulations running continuously inside the United Earth Admiralty's deep computing network for the last 4 years. Simulations built around one specific enemy. The Drevek. Lieutenant Commander Dara Mbeki approached from the navigation station, tablet in hand. She was 29 years old, the youngest officer on the bridge, and she had a habit of pulling her bottom lip between her teeth when she was nervous that she had never quite managed to break. Her lip was firmly between her teeth right now. Admiral, we have updated imagery from the yokai drone net. The Drevek have established a picket line at the edge of the Velthari system, 30 ships minimum, possibly more behind the debris field. She paused. They're not moving. They're waiting. Good, Osai said. Mbeki blinked. Good. Stationary target. Osai tapped the display, zooming out to show the full approach corridor. They expect us to slow down, to assess, to request identification. That's what every other conquered species does, announces itself, demands negotiation, gives the other side time to adapt. She traced a line from their current position straight through the picket formation without deviation. We're not going to do that. The bridge was quiet. Outside the viewports, stars stretched into faint lines as the fleet pushed past a threshold of velocity that would have been considered theoretically impractical 5 years ago. Os had not become an admiral by accepting theoretical limitations. Below decks, in the crew quarters of the Thermopylae, a young weapons technician named Corporal Hideo Tanaka was writing a letter. He wrote letters often, though he never sent them. It was a habit he'd picked up from his grandmother, who had told him once that the act of writing something down made it real in a way that thinking never could. So he wrote, "We're 3 days out from the Velthari system. Everyone on board knows what happened there. Nobody's talking about it much, but you can feel it, this particular kind of quiet that settles over people when they're angry but focused. I've been on this ship for 2 years and I've never felt the crew like this before. We are not scared. I want to be clear about that. We are not scared. We are something older than scared. Something that doesn't have a gentle name." He paused, chewed the end of his stylus. The Drevak wiped out a civilization overnight. They killed 400,000 people on the ground alone. They did it because they could, and because they thought no one would stop them. I keep thinking about that, about what it means to be the thing that proves them wrong. He folded the letter, put it in the drawer with the others. Then he went back to running calibration checks on his weapons console. because Admiral Os had made it very clear that every single system on every single ship needed to be flawless before they arrived. He was going to make sure it was. Back on the bridge, Osai received a second transmission from Ambassador Saren. The Conquered Council had been informed that Earth's fleet was moving. The reactions ranged from skepticism to outright alarm, not at the Drevak, but at the humans. Several delegates are demanding you stand down. Saren's voice was tight. They believe an unsanctioned military action will provoke further Drevak aggression. Osai considered this for exactly 2 seconds. Tell them, she said calmly, that the Drevak will not need to be further provoked. Tell them that the Drevak made their intentions clear the moment they stopped accepting surrenders. She paused. And tell Delegate Foss that measured response is a philosophy best held by people who still have someone left to protect. She closed the channel. Outside, the stars continued to stream past. The fleet flew on 47 ships, dark and fast, and unbothered by the galaxy's opinion of them. In the distance, 11 years of preparation were about to meet their reason for existing. Warlord Supreme Keth Varun had a ritual after every conquest. He stood alone on the forward observation deck of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, a vessel so massive that smaller Drevak ships used it as a navigational reference point the way other species use stars, and he looked at what remained, not out of guilt. The concept had been surgically removed from Drevak military culture 300 years ago, replaced with something cleaner and more useful: assessment. What remained told you the quality of your victory. Too much remaining meant you had been inefficient. Too little meant you had wasted resources. The perfect conquest left exactly the right amount of wreckage, enough to send a message, not so much that it became a monument. The Vilthari system looked, to Keth Varun's eye, nearly perfect. The fleet was gone. The orbital infrastructure was gone. The northern continent of the homeworld had been rendered uninhabitable. The southern region still had survivors, deliberately, because survivors spread fear more effectively than silence. Fear was a resource, and Keth Varun was an excellent economist of it. His second, General Vethkalar, entered the observation deck with the measured footsteps of a soldier who had served under Keth Varun for 30 years and therefore knew exactly how close to approach and when to stop. The Conquered Council is in session, Vethkalar reported. Our intelligence assets indicate significant internal division. No military response is being organized. Several member species have already made informal inquiries about non-aggression terms. Keth Varun didn't respond immediately. He was watching a piece of a Vilthari cruiser rotate slowly through the debris field, sunlight catching the edge of its shattered hull at irregular intervals. Flash, dark, flash, dark. And the others, he asked, the ones who haven't made inquiries yet. Frightened, Vethkalar said, but passive. We estimate 3 months before Conquered cohesion breaks down entirely. 2, Keth Varun corrected. He finally turned away from the viewport. His face was the color of old slate, crossed with the ritual scarring his rank required, and his eyes were a deep amber that had never once looked uncertain in Vethkalar's memory. Fear spoils quickly if you don't act on it. We move to the Pelithari border in 6 days. Begin resupply. Vethkalar nodded, then hesitated. There is one anomaly, Supreme One. Keth Varun raised an eyebrow. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He found it inefficient. Our long-range array detected subspace wake signatures approximately 19 hours ago, origin traced to the Sol system. Vethkalar's tone was carefully neutral in the way that soldiers' voices became carefully neutral when they were not sure how their superior would react to information. The signatures suggest a fleet-sized formation. The configuration is unfamiliar. Sol, Keth Varun repeated. The humans, Supreme One. A pause. Then Keth Varun made a sound that, in Drevak culture, was the equivalent of a dismissive laugh, a short exhale through the nose, a slight shift of the jaw. Humans, he said. The word carried the particular weight of a thing that has been categorized and filed and does not need to be revisited. Their largest registered vessel is barely a kilometer long. Their weapons technology is roughly comparable to the Velthari levels of 60 years ago. They have no combat experience against a peer opponent. Our assessments confirm this, Vethkalar agreed, though I should note the assessments are 11 years old. Species do not advance that quickly. No, Supreme One, of course not. Kethvarun returned to his viewport. If they're coming to witness, or to negotiate safe passage for their people once we reach that arm of the galaxy. Either way, receive them politely when they arrive and explain the new order of things. He paused. Leave the picket fleet where they are. If the humans approach without hailing, consider it a territorial provocation and respond accordingly. A beat. But use the 7th formation. I don't want them destroyed before I can speak with their commanders. A species that comes to negotiate while still moving their fleet shows spirit. I have uses for spirit. Vethkalar bowed and left. Kethvarun stood alone in the dark, watching the dead Velthari ship rotate in the void, and felt, in the deep and private architecture of his mind, something approaching contentment. He did not feel it for long. 2 hours later, on the long-range sensor deck deep in the Eternal Dominion's belly, a young Drevak sensor operator named Torek registered an anomaly. The human fleet had not slowed down. He checked the readings 3 times because the numbers seemed wrong. Ships slowed down when they approached an occupied system. It was simple physics and simpler psychology. You decelerated to scan, to assess, to establish communication, to demonstrate that you were not hostile so that the people pointing weapons at you would take a breath before firing. The human fleet was not decelerating. It was, if his instruments were correct, accelerating. Torek reached for his communication panel to flag the bridge. His sensors pinged once. Then the long-range array went dark. He tapped the console, rebooted the system, ran a diagnostic. Nothing, just silence where data used to be. He frowned and reached for the comm again, and that was when the sound reached them. Not an explosion, not yet. Something stranger. The structured electromagnetic shriek of 30 warships having their sensor nets simultaneously blinded by a targeted pulse. Torek had never heard that sound before in his life. He would not hear anything after it. The 30 Drevak ships of the picket fleet had been given a simple task. Hold the approach corridor, challenge any vessel attempting to enter the system, and destroy anything that came through without identifying itself. They were experienced crews. They were well armed. They had participated in the destruction of the Velthari fleet 6 days prior, and their confidence, sharpened by easy victory, was running at the particular kind of high that comes from never having met something you couldn't handle. Commander Riesh Davar of the picket lead ship Inviolable Supremacy watched the human formation resolve on his tactical display and felt, for the first time since his commissioning, a specific sensation in his chest that he chose to interpret as battle readiness rather than the alternative. The humans had not slowed. They had not hailed. They had not formed into a negotiating spread or a defensive posture or any configuration that his 30 years of experience could categorize as anything other than a direct attack run. Charge all forward batteries, he said. His voice was steady. He was a professional. Target the lead vessel. Fire at maximum range. Aboard the UEAS Thermopylae, Admiral Osai stood at the center of her bridge and watched the incoming fire on the tactical display with the calm expression of a woman who had modeled this exact scenario 400 times in simulation and was now watching it happen within acceptable parameters. Shields to forward concentration, she said. The Drevak salvo hit like a wall. The Thermopylae shuddered, a deep, structural shudder that you felt in your back teeth and your spine simultaneously. Damage reports flickered across secondary screens. A power coupling on Deck 9 failed. A young ensign at the navigation console grabbed the edge of her station with both hands. Then the shuddering stopped. Osai looked at her shield integrity readout. 68%. She had planned for 50. She was ahead of schedule. "Return fire," she said. "All ships execute pattern CASI, don't stop moving." What happened next was observed by 3 Yokai long-range drones that Ambassador Saren had positioned at the edge of the system specifically, because she had, in some intuitive and thoroughly unscientific part of herself, wanted to be watching when the humans arrived. The footage those drones captured would later be studied in every military academy in conquered space for the next 200 years. The human ships did not respond to the Drevak salvo in any way that conquered tactical doctrine would recognize. They did not form a defensive screen. They did not designate a protected core. They did not, at any point, slow down. Instead, they spread, each vessel breaking in a different direction simultaneously, the formation dissolving into what looked, for 3 terrifying seconds, like chaos, before resolving something else entirely. A 3-dimensional encirclement pattern moving at speeds that the Drevak fleet had never been required to track. Drevak returned fire at targets that were no longer where they had been. The human ships returned fire at targets that were exactly where targeting systems they would be. There is a significant difference between weapons designed to damage and weapons designed to destroy. Conquered ships, even military vessels, were built around a form cultural and diplomatic preference for leaving the enemy not all integrity to eventually surrender, to negotiate, to be absorbed or protected. It was a philosophy of war that had served the conquered well in its internal conflicts over 2 centuries. The Drevak had never adopted that philosophy, which was why 400,000 Vilthari civilians were dead. The humans, it appeared, had adopted a different philosophy entirely. The first human volley detonated the Inviolable Supremacy's reactor containment. There was, briefly, a star where Commander Rieshtavar's ship had been. The second volley took 3 ships simultaneously, the targeting solution so precisely calculated that all 3 detonations occurred within 0.4 seconds of each other, generating an overlapping shockwave that caught 2 additional Drevak vessels in the debris radius. 4 minutes and 19 seconds after the first Drevak shot, the picket fleet ceased to exist. On the Conquered Council feed, where a dozen species watched the drone footage in real time, there was a silence so complete that the ambient hum of the station's environmental systems became audible. Then someone, the record would later show it was Delegate Orvan of the Pelithari, the same delegate who had tried and failed to organize a military response, said very quietly in his native language, "Stars above." Nobody disagreed. 1 human frigate had taken heavy damage. The UEAS Kigali was running on emergency power, her port side badly torn, 2 of her 3 main weapons arrays offline. But she was still there, still flying. She broadcast a message in Drevak, a language that human xenolinguistics teams had spent 8 years translating in secret for exactly this moment. The message was 7 words. "We are coming for your warlord." On the drone feed, Ambassador Saren watched the burning remains of 30 Drevak warships drift through the approach corridor and felt the hair rise along the back of her neck. Not from fear, though fear was certainly present, woven through her like cold wire. From something more complicated. Something that lived right next to gratitude and right next to awe and did not quite have a name in her language. She thought, looking at that footage, that perhaps this was what it had always felt like to be standing near humans when they finally decided that enough was enough. She was very glad they were on her side. The footage ran for 4 minutes and 19 seconds. Within 6 hours, it had been transmitted to every inhabited system in conquered space. Within 12, it had been viewed by an estimated combined population of 40 billion. Within 24, it had changed the political architecture of 3 separate civilizations and caused a Emrithian government minister to resign, though he refused to specify which part of the recording had prompted his decision. There was something about the way the human ships moved. That was the thing people kept coming back to, regardless of species, regardless of political affiliation. The Drevak had always been terrifying in the way that a natural disaster is terrifying, overwhelming, inevitable, mechanical in their destruction. But the humans moved like something alive, like something angry. They didn't hold formation because they didn't need to. Each ship seemed to think independently and collectively at the same time, some deep synchronization between crews and commanders that looked, to any watching species, less like a military operation and more like 47 organisms sharing one purpose. A yokai military analyst named Peter Velshon watched it 17 times in sequence, pausing and rewinding at specific moments, before writing in her official assessment. They were not trying to win. They were trying to finish. The Concord Council reconvened under very different atmospheric conditions than its previous session. Delegate Foss of the Emrethian Sovereignty had prepared another speech about measured response. He sat down before delivering it, which was, in diplomatic terms, the loudest statement he made that day. Delegate Orvan, who 4 days ago had stood alone in proposing military action, said almost nothing. He spent most of the session watching the human fleets tracking data on his personal display, a small, unreadable expression on his face. It was a junior delegate, a young Pelithari named Sirankes, on her first assignment to Concord Station, who asked the question everyone was thinking but had been too polished, too senior, too invested in maintaining composure to voice. "Are we safe?" she said. "From them, I mean the humans." The chamber went quiet. It was Ambassador Saren who answered because she had kept the communication channel open and she knew, better than anyone else in that room, what she'd heard in the Admiral's 11-minute response. "Yes," she said. "They came because we called. They don't want what the Drevak want. They're not here for territory." She paused. "They're here because their allies were killed and the rest of us did nothing. There's a difference." Sirankes considered this. "How can you be sure?" Saren was quiet for a moment. "Because if they wanted what the Drevak wanted, we'd already know." Across the station, in a small neutral space diplomatic suite that smelled of recycled air and Drevak incense, Ambassador-at-Large Dural Khan, the Drevak's official Concord liaison, a career diplomat who had spent 40 years keeping the supremacy's expansion, triggering a formal Concord military response. Hacking. It's admitted his formal asylum request 6 minutes to watch drone footage. He had not told his guard. He had not waited for instructions. He had simply watched 4 minutes and 19 seconds of video, then stood, walked to the personal terminal, and filled out the form with the steady hand of a man who had made a decision and felt, for the first time in a long time, peace. He was granted asylum within the hour. Later, when asked what specifically had prompted his decision, Dural Khan was quiet for a moment. He said, "The Drevak always won because Concord was afraid to truly fight. But when and understood, the Concord was afraid because none of them ever needed to fight the way humans fight. The humans don't fight to negotiate a better position. They fight because something inside them genuinely cannot stop until it is done." He folded his hands. "I have spent 40 years telling myself that the supremacy was inevitable. I watched that footage and I knew. The humans spent 11 years telling themselves something different." He didn't say anything else. On a public communications channel that was supposed to be off the record, but was, of course, immediately leaked, a human diplomatic attaché named Second Officer Remy Adami was cornered by a cluster of Concord journalists outside the station's transit hub. They wanted a statement. They wanted an explanation. They wanted, in the way that frightened populations have always wanted, to be told something that made sense. Adami was 26 years old and had been awake for 31 hours. She considered her words for exactly 4 seconds. "The Drevak wiped out a civilization," she said. "They killed people who called for help and got silence. We decided that was unacceptable. That's it." "But you had no treaty obligation," one journalist pressed. "No territorial stake, no formal alliance." "We had people asking for help," Adami said simply. "What other stake do you need?" She walked away. The journalists looked at each other. The clip ran on every conquered network for the next 72 hours. Far from the station, in the dark between stars, the human fleet was still moving, 38 hours from the main Drevak formation. OS had received the council transmissions. She had read the political fallout reports. She had noted Dural Khan's asylum request with quiet satisfaction. A Drevak diplomat breaking meant the Supremacy's information network in conquered space was now compromised, which meant Keth Varun was flying partially blind. She had added it to her tactical picture and moved on. Mbeki brought her a meal that she ate standing up, staring at the projection of the Velthari system. The debris field, the quiet southern continent with its surviving population, the geometric Drevak formation waiting behind it like a wall. "They know we're coming," Mbeki said. "Yes," Osa agreed. "Their formation is defensive. They're waiting for us to engage on their terms." "Yes. So we don't engage on their terms." Osa looked at her lieutenant commander with something close to a smile. "You're going to be very good at this job," she said. She set down her empty container and walked back to the tactical display. 38 hours. She had been planning for 11 years. 38 hours was more than enough time. Keth Varun had not achieved the rank of Warlord Supreme by underestimating things. That was the lie his subordinates told themselves that he had, that his dismissal of the human fleet had been a mistake born of arrogance. It was a comfortable lie, the kind that losing sides always constructed afterward to make sense of the rubble. The truth was more unsettling. Keth Varun had looked at the human fleet and made a perfectly rational assessment based on perfectly accurate data, and the data had been wrong. Not old, not poorly gathered. Wrong in the way that data about a thing is always wrong when that thing has spent 11 years becoming something that your intelligence network never thought to look for. He stood over the wreckage reports from the picket fleet and felt, for the first time in his adult life, the specific sensation of having been surprised by something that should not have been surprising. He did not waste time on shame. He began working. Within 4 hours of the picket fleet's destruction, the Eternal Dominion had transmitted new orders across the entire Drevak main fleet. 212 warships, the largest single military formation the Supremacy had fielded in 30 years, repositioned around the Velthari system in a configuration that Keth Varun had designed himself. A layered defensive formation with overlapping fields of fire, strong enough to stop anything the Conquered had ever fielded, and by his calculations, strong enough to stop anything the humans had demonstrated so far. He sent probes, 30 of them, dispersed in a wide net across the approach corridor, each one tasked with gathering detailed sensor data on the human fleet. He wanted weapons signatures. He wanted shield harmonic profiles. He wanted velocity curves and thrust-to-mass ratios and the specific electromagnetic signatures that human targeting systems emitted when they locked onto a target. He wanted every piece of data that his intelligence service had failed to gather in 11 years, and he wanted it in the next 30 hours. He got most of it, not all. Some probes were destroyed quietly, efficiently, by human point defense systems that his analysts had not known existed. The ones that survived gave him enough. He studied it with the focused intensity that had made him dangerous since the age of 14. General Vethkalar found him in the strategy room at the 13th hour, surrounded by holographic projections of human ship configurations, his dinner untouched on the side table. "You should eat, Supreme One. The human weapons have a longer effective range than our estimates," Keth Varun said, not looking up, "by approximately 40%, and their shield technology doesn't attenuate the way ours does at high energy throughput. It actually becomes more efficient. They designed it specifically for sustained engagement." He tapped a data node. "This is not a civilization that built a fleet to intimidate. Everything in this design profile was engineered for a long, dirty, prolonged fight." Vethkalar was quiet for a moment. "That is concerning." "That is clarifying," Keth Varun corrected. He finally looked up. "We will not win a prolonged engagement in open space, so we will not fight in open space." He pulled up the Velthari system map. They will approach from the corridor here. The debris field from the Velthari fleet gives us a sensor shadow on the eastern approach. We position 40 ships there. When the human formation enters engagement range, they will be focused on our forward two-thirds. The eastern group strikes from their flank. At that range, with that density of fire, we kill the flagship first, Veth-Kalar said, understanding. We kill the flagship first, Keth Varun agreed. Military units have a psychological breaking point even when their doctrine tells them otherwise. Humans are not different from anyone else in that regard. Lose the command vessel, lose the command. The formation fragments. We pick them apart. Veth-Kalar studied the projection. It was, he had to admit, a strong plan. When do you expect them? 36 hours, perhaps 34. Keth Varun finally picked up his dinner. They haven't decelerated. A short pause. They still haven't decelerated. No, Keth Varun ate. He was thinking. They're not going to either. They're going to come in at engagement velocity, which means they've done the math on our formation's reaction time, and they actually believe that speed gives them an advantage even against 200 ships. He chewed, swallowed. I want our fastest vessels in the forward echelon. If they won't slow down, we take that option away by meeting them at range. And the flagship, their Thermopylae. Priority target. The moment she's in range, every available weapon concentrates on her until she stops. He said it simply, without heat. A professional assessment. Their Admiral Osai, our records say, though their old records will have anticipated that she's a target. She'll have countermeasures, but nothing built to take that much fire for that long will still be standing at the end of it. What Keth Varun did not know, what his probes had failed to capture, and his intelligence service had never thought to look for, was this. Admiral Osai had been aware of the eastern debris field for 11 years. It appeared in the very first Admiralty simulation she had run on the Velthari system, back when she had been a junior captain quietly building a case for why Earth needed to take the Drevak seriously. The debris field was an obvious hiding spot. The flanking maneuver it enabled was elegant and sensible. It was, in fact, exactly what she would have done in Keth Varun's position. She had spent the last 18 hours planning around it. Mbeki had asked her, somewhere around hour 14, how she could be so certain that was where the ambush would be. Osai had looked at her with that calm, slightly tired expression that she wore when the answer seemed obvious and she was working out how to say so kindly. Because I've spent 11 years studying Keth Varun, she said. His formation choices, his preferred engagement ranges, the way he uses terrain, he is very good. He is possibly the best commander the Drevak have ever produced. She paused. But he's never fought anyone who spent 11 years studying him. That's the variable he can't model. 32 hours before the fleets met, a Drevak sensor officer reported to Keth Varun that the human formation had made a small, seemingly minor course adjustment. Keth Varun looked at the new heading for a long time. His jaw tightened, just slightly, just once. Adjust the eastern formation to compensate, he said. Supreme 1. The officer hesitated. The human heading change would place them out of the eastern formation's optimal firing arc regardless of repositioning. To maintain the ambush, we would need to. I know what we would need to do. Keth Varun stood very still for a moment. Then, execute the forward defense, full formation. We fight them straight. Veth-Kalar, standing at the edge of the room, met no one's eyes. He recognized what he was seeing, because he had served this man for 30 years and he knew every shade of his commander's silences. Keth Varun was not afraid. Fear was not the name for it. It was something more precise. The crystalline, vertiginous sensation of realizing, for the first time in your life, that you might be the one who had been studied. That the game you thought you were playing might have been observed, cataloged, and prepared for by the other side since before you knew the other side existed. It was the feeling of a predator discovering, far too late, that it had walked into something's territory. The Battle of Velthari's grave began at 04:17 station time, when the UEAS Thermopylae crossed into weapons range of the Drevak forward line, and immediately opened fire on 3 targets simultaneously. It did not begin cleanly. Nothing about it was clean. The first hour was the worst. Keth Varun's formation was deep and disciplined, and 200 warships firing in rotating salvos generated a volume of fire that even the human fleet's advanced shielding struggled to absorb. The UEAS Algiers took a sustained hit to her engine core in the 3rd minute and went dark, drifting. The UEAS Nairobi lost all weapons in her forward section, but kept moving, using herself as a physical barrier to pull Drevek fire away from 2 smaller frigates behind her. A decision made by her captain alone, in real time, with no order from the admiral, because that was the kind of crew Osai had built. On the Thermopylae bridge, damage reports came in a continuous stream. Mbeki called them out in the flat, clipped voice of someone fully committed to professionalism as a survival strategy. Os listened, registered, and continued issuing corrections to the fleet formation with the concentrated calm of someone who had rehearsed this in their mind so many times that the rehearsal and the reality had become indistinguishable. "Move the frigate wing to Sector 7, she said. "I want them behind the debris field before the Drevak second echelon repositions. The debris field will degrade our sensors." "It'll degrade theirs more. Move them." The second hour shifted. The Drevak second echelon, the 40 ships Keth Varun had originally intended for the eastern ambush, now folded into the main line, held the numerical advantage and pressed it. But the human ships were faster, and what they lacked in numbers they compensated for in the particular brutal efficiency of their weapon systems. Where a conquered warship required 4 to 6 direct hits to knock out a Drevak vessel of comparable size, human ships required 2. Sometimes 1, if the shot placement was right. The targeting systems were something that the Drevak had never faced, because they had never faced anyone who had spent 11 years specifically modeling the weak points in Drevak hull architecture. The ratio began to shift, slowly, painfully. The UEAS Bunker Hill was in the 4th hour. She had taken damage in the first exchange, significant damage. Her entire starboard weapons array gone, structural integrity on her lower decks compromised. Her captain, Commander Adisa Kamau, had received the order to pull back to the secondary line for emergency repairs. He had acknowledged the order. He had not followed it, because Kamau had seen, in the tactical display, that the frigate wing Osai had positioned in the debris field needed a corridor to complete the flanking maneuver that was, right now, the thing standing between this battle and a very different outcome. And that corridor was blocked by 4 Drevak destroyers who had no reason to move, unless something gave them a very compelling reason. Kamau opened shipwide comm. "All right," he said. His voice was remarkably steady. "Here's what we're going to do." What the Bunker Hill did, moving at full thrust, weapons firing continuously from her remaining port array, drawing the concentrated fire of 4 Drevak destroyers long enough for the frigate wing to clear the corridor and establish the flanking position, took 11 minutes. The Bunker Hill survived for 9 of them. The frigate wing made it through. Admiral Osai received the report about the Bunker Hill in the 5th hour. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Her expression did not change because she was on the bridge and because she had made a decision, a long time ago, about who she was when people were watching her. She filed the name. She filed the crew manifest. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept all the things she would carry for the rest of her life. Then she said, "Execute pattern endurance. All remaining ships push their forward line now." The battle lasted 9 hours total. 3 human ships were destroyed outright. 14 were heavily damaged, including the Thermopylae herself, whose port shield array failed in the 8th hour and whose hull took direct fire that buckled 2 entire deck sections and killed 16 crew members. When the damage report came in, Mbeki's voice broke slightly on the last number, just once, and then she continued. The Drevak formation collapsed in the 9th hour, not all at once, but like a structure that has been slowly losing load-bearing points, finally reaching the one it cannot compensate for. Keth-Varun's command ships tried to reorganize the shattered line. Osai had planned for this too. The reorganization was met with precise, concentrated fire on the command node specifically, a targeting priority she had established in the battle plan 11 years ago and never changed. At 13:34, the last Drevek flagship stopped moving. At 13:41, Keth-Varun's personal shuttle escaping, she noted without surprise, was intercepted by the UEAS Kigali, the same damaged frigate that had broadcast the 7-word message after the picket fleet. The Kigali was running on one engine and had no functional weapons. Her captain used the ship itself, parking it directly in the shuttle's path at close range, because the admiral's orders had been explicit. No execution, no martyrdom, take him alive. They took him alive. Osai stood in the silence that followed and looked at her bridge. At Mbeki, who had been awake for 22 hours. At the young ensign who had grabbed her console in the first salvo and never let go since. At the damage indicators still glowing red across half her boards. She thought about the bunker hill, about Kamau's voice steady on the shipwide comm. She thought about 11 years. Then she opened the channel to the conquered council, all of them, every delegate, because she had earned the right to speak to all of them now, and she said 3 sentences. The Supremacy's fleet is neutralized. We will remain in theater to ensure compliance. Send your relief ships to Velthari, they'll need help. She closed the channel. Outside the viewport, the debris field that had once been 2 fleets now included what had once been 1 more. Somewhere in the wreckage, in a system that had been used as a slaughterhouse 6 days ago, the southern continent of the Velthari homeworld still had people alive on it. They were going to stay alive. That was the point of all of it. That had always been the point. 3 weeks after the Battle of Velthari's grave, the Drevak supremacy began to fracture. It started at the edges, the way collapse always does. Frontier garrisons that had been held in line by Keth-Varun's personal authority, an authority built entirely on the belief that the supremacy was invincible, began to receive different signals from the core worlds. Signals that contradicted each other. Signals full of the static of political emergency. 2 regional governors declared independence within the same 48-hour window. A third petitioned the conquered for observer status, which the conquered, still processing its own transformation, granted with a speed that surprised everyone including the conquered. The supremacy had been built on fear. Fear required the appearance of inevitability. The appearance of inevitability had lasted precisely as long as nothing credible had challenged it. It took 9 hours to end 400 years. Keth-Varun was held in a secure facility on conquered station Muravel, while his fate was negotiated by 37 different parties, all of whom had opinions. The process was expected to take years. He refused to speak to anyone except through his legal representative, a Pelithari defense advocate who had never previously handled a case of this magnitude and who was, according to station gossip, handling it with remarkable composure. In his holding cell twice daily, Keth-Varun was brought a recording. The Conquered's restorative justice framework required it, testimonials from survivors of worlds under Drevak attack. The Velthari survivors specifically. He was not required to watch. He watched everyone. What he thought while watching no one knew, he never said. On the UEAS Thermopylae, still parked in theater while her engineering crews worked around the clock on the damaged hull sections, Admiral Osai received 347 commendation requests, 2 political appointments, both declined. A formal letter of thanks from the yokai government sealed with their highest diplomatic honor, and 1 very long, very emotional personal message from Ambassador Saren that Os read twice, alone in her cabin, before filing it in the same part of her mind, where she kept the Bunker Hills crew manifest. Mbeki knocked on her door on the morning of the 22nd day and told her that Ambassador Saren had requested permission to come aboard. Osai said yes without hesitation. Saren arrived with a small diplomatic party and the particular bearing of someone trying very hard to appear calm. She had seen the footage of the battle, of course. everyone had. But there was a difference between sensor footage and standing on the bridge of the ship that had fought it, seeing the repaired seams in the bulkhead, the replaced console panels still a slightly different shade from the originals, the scorch mark on the deck plate outside the port corridor that no one had gotten around to buffing out yet. Osei gave her a brief tour. Not long. Neither of them were the type for ceremony. They ended up in the Admiral's observation room, a narrow space at the ship's prow with a forward viewport looking out into the dark. The Velthari system was behind them. The stars ahead were quiet. Saren was quiet for a while. Then, the Council is discussing Earth's seat. Several delegates are proposing a structural reclassification of your species' status in Concord, a senior tier, with corresponding influence over collective decisions. She paused. Some of them are frightened of what that means. Others think it's overdue by about 30 years. What do you think? Osei asked. Saren tilted her head. I think you saved 30 civilizations from spending the next generation trying to figure out how to appease a regime that doesn't accept appeasement. I think the Concord owes you something it isn't sure how to quantify. She looked at the Admiral carefully. I also think you didn't come here for political leverage. You didn't come for a seat or a tier or a reclassification. No, Osei agreed. Why then? It was the question Saren had been holding since the moment she'd opened that channel. Not rhetorically, genuinely. She had told the council chamber that humans had come because they were called. She believed it, but she wanted to hear it from the source. Osei was quiet for a moment. Outside, light caught the edge of a slowly rotating piece of debris, the way it always did in systems like this, in the aftermath of things like this. Flash, dark, flash. When I was 12, she said, there was a flood, regional disaster, hundreds of people trapped. My grandmother's community put out a distress call and for about 9 hours nothing came. People were dying, not from the water, from the waiting. She paused. Eventually help arrived. They were sorry it took so long. They had their own logistics problems, their own competing priorities, all completely understandable. She looked at the viewport. My grandmother never forgot the 9 hours, not the flood. The 9 hours. She turned back to Saren. You called. 9 minutes later we answered. She said it simply, without drama. Because we remembered what the 9 hours felt like. And because we decided, a long time ago, that we weren't going to be the ones who made someone else wait through theirs. Saren didn't say anything. There wasn't anything adequate to say. On the Velthari homeworld, in the surviving southern regions, conquered relief convoys began arriving on the 25th day. Food, medical technology, atmospheric processors to begin addressing the damage in the adjacent regions, engineering teams. Flying escort for every convoy, scarred, mismatched, their hulls still carrying the specific geography of 9 hours of battle, were the human ships. They would stay for 8 months. They stayed not because they were ordered to, not because of political agreement or treaty obligation, but because Osei made a single request to the Admiralty, and the Admiralty said yes without deliberating. We will see them through. The Velthari survivors, 2 million people living in the wreckage of a civilization that had been ancient when humanity was still building its first fires, had a tradition. When someone saved your life, you learned their name, not their title, not their designation, their name, the personal, particular, irreplaceable name, because a name was how you said, I know you exist, I know you specifically, you matter. Over 8 months, 2 million Velthari learned the name of every human who had come. Every single one. In the conquered records, the Battle of Velthari's grave would be classified as the conflict that ended the Drevak supremacy, restructured conquered political hierarchy, and established humanity as a primary peacekeeping power in their arm of the galaxy. In the personal journals of a young weapons technician named Hideo Tanaka, who survived with a burn scar on his left forearm, and a story he would spend the rest of his life struggling to find adequate words for, it was recorded differently. We went because they called. We stayed because they needed us. We fought because the alternative was unacceptable. That's it. That's all of it. I don't know if that makes us heroes or just people who couldn't look the other way. He paused, tapped the stylus against his chin. I think maybe those are the same thing. He folded the letter. This one he kept. End S.